And if you notice, this is our last chapter. So we have gone all the way through the book of Hebrews. And today we may stretch this lesson into 2 lessons just because there's a lot in this last chapter. And I don't want to rush it. We do have books for the next series. We talked about doing a series on Psalms. So this is a book on, or the next study book. So if you want to grab one of these after class, we've got a set of those. So we may be starting that either next week or the week after. We'll see how far we get today. But if you want to go and grab that to be ready for next week, we'll be doing that. And then my dad and I have been talking, thinking of in the future, because we don't want to wait till we get towards the end of a series and what are we doing next? So if you've got topics or books that you want us to study and try to bring to you and give some more insight, then let us know. This is your class, so hopefully it's for your enrichment and your knowledge. So if there's topics that you think we should be focusing on, I've been talking with Brother Jacob about doing a discipleship series, because they're doing a discipleship series with the teens and taking them through that, and I think it'd be good for us to be refreshed on what it means to disciple and the basics of discipleship, so that we can be discipling, you all can be discipling my generation and the younger generation as well. And so that's the hope. So we'll be thinking about that kind of as the next series out beyond that. So, but the books are up here. So Hebrews chapter 13. Let me get situated here. So we've gone through a lot, and Hebrews is a deep book, as we've talked about. He's taken several topics and he's really broken them out, taken his time to go through them. The priesthood, the tabernacle, the new covenant. He's gone through all of that, and he's taken several chapters to do that. And then we get to these last 3 chapters. Oops, hit the wrong button. The last 3 chapters, and we see in chapter 11, that really sums it up as far as the practical aspects of the Christian faith. We see the first one in chapter 11 is about enduring by faith. The hall of faith that's there, and what faith means, and how it fits towards, okay, we've heard how better Christ is, now what's that mean for our faith? And that's what those examples talk about, is that Christ was, should be where we're placing our faith. And then in chapter 12, we see we endure with hope. And so we see faith and hope, and guess what chapter 13 is? Love. And so we see in chapter 12, last week we looked at running our race with patience. We looked at the reason of the hope, our discipline. Who is our trainer, if we want to say that, for lack of a better word, for our marathon that we're in? Jesus Christ, right? And he's also our hope. We were talking about the idea that he's the one that's already run the race, so I can be confident that the race can be run, right? He's the one I have hope in. So I can trust the one that's done it right and done it well, to train me and to make sure I'm going to finish my course along with him. We looked at the response of diligence. We've got to be diligent in that training. We can't just can't just give up. And then there's a reward for faithfulness, and through it all, there's reverence for God, the one that cheers us on, the one that motivates us, the one that's the reason for it all. So that was our study last week, and really what we're asking is, in these last 3 chapters, is if Christ is the better sacrifice, priest, and covenant, then what does that look like in our lives? How is that reflected in my faith, my hope, and my love? If Christ really is the better, what's the impact on my life? Am I faithful, as those were in that faithful hall of fame? Or do I have the hope? Am I running like I've got a reward at the end? Am I running like I can make it to the end? That's the idea of hope. How does my Christian life look? Am I just kind of, every time I come up against a challenge, I got to take a break? And kind of sit by the side and wait for everybody else to pass me, then I can start going. No, it's about the idea of hope. How does it impact our life? And today we're going to look at how does it impact our love, and how do we endure through love? And one of the authors, commentators, talked about in this book, this last chapter. He's kind of like the boxer. He starts throwing punches, and he doesn't. These are short and quick punches. And I was thinking of what's our boxer? Sorry, Rachel's trying to give me that. What's our evangelist? My name just went. Brother Pruitt. Sorry, Brother Pruitt. And his telling of his stories when he was a boxer. And this chapter just reminded me of Brother Pruitt in a sense. He doesn't pull any punches in this. He throws punches really quick, and we'll see that in this first verse. But there's a lot of power behind it. And we've seen that he's drawn out and it's almost I don't watch a lot of boxing, but I've seen some, and you see kind of in the beginning rounds, it's kind of slow, and they're kind of testing each other out. Well, that's kind of the book of Hebrews. And then he gets to this last round, and he's just like, okay, I'm going to lay it on them. And we're going to go for the knockout punch on this. So that's what comes to mind when you see this. So let's look at the first verse. Oh, sorry, and before we start, we're talking about love. And so I want to bring this up again because I think it's interesting as we tie what Christ says about love and then what he says about love in this. And Jesus said unto them, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy soul, and thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And this last verse means more to me now that I've read Hebrews and studied Hebrews than it did when I first taught this lesson. Because on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. It's interesting that he ends with a chapter that focuses on love and how we love one another in the church and outside the church. Because what's important, where does the law and the prophets, that last verse gets it. The law and the prophets weren't enough. That love was much more than the law and the prophets, put it that way. We just did the law and we just did what the prophet said. That wasn't enough, right? And we'll see that later on, that obedience, that the heart was important to be able to make the law and the prophets enough, right? The believing in Christ, putting our faith and trust in Christ. So let's start. The first 4 verses here he talks about is focused on commitment. And the first commitment we see is it says a real simple verse. And I pulled out some, I did a little internet search. So I've got some for the younger crowd. These are memes. Have you ever heard somebody talk about a meme on the internet? It's where someone's taken a picture and put some words on it. And it's supposed to be powerful. It's supposed to give you, in a moment glance. Well, people have taken these verses in the Bible and made memes out of them. So I thought this was an interesting way I'm going to show it to you, because you're going to see these verses not just written out, but people use these verses kind of stand alone. But keep them in the context. What were the Hebrews facing at the time? What were the Hebrews facing? Persecution, right? They were being persecuted. They were being rejected by their families. They were saying, by choosing Christ, they were facing, the darkest days because their families were rejecting them. The Romans were coming down on them. They didn't have a lot of hope and things to look forward to. They had a lot of challenges, and so we think about these verses, keep them in context. This isn't just, we use them as commandments, but this is what they were facing. And it was ever important for them to be focused on these commandments here, these guidance here that they get. So the first one we see is let brotherly love continue. Sounds real simple, right? What's it mean by brotherly love? Who's he talking about there? Is he talking about our families? No, who's he talking about? The church, right? He's talking about the church. Because we know he's talked earlier about us being together now as a church. That we're no longer strangers. My dad and I were talking about in chapter 11 where he says, or chapter 10, where he says, that not forsaking the assembling of yourselves. Why do you think he had to give that commandment? What did the tabernacle do for the Israelites? Where did they have to be, proximity-wise, to the tabernacle, if you're going to live a good Israel or Jewish life? Where'd you have to be? Near the tabernacle, right? You couldn't stray off and go somewhere else, because what happened if you sinned? So where do you have to go? Back to the tabernacle, right? So there was some proximity that was forced in the Jewish life. You had to be near the temple. You had to be able to offer sacrifices for your sins. What happens when we're saved now? Where do you have to be? You don't have to be near the temple, right? Because what's happened? Where's the tabernacle? Within us, right? God has given, that's through Christ. We have access to the Holy of Holies. So now, what was the commandment that Christ also gave? Did he say, I want you to stay here in Jerusalem and stay together just like your Jewish community was? What did he tell them? Go out. So what's the potential problem that happens if I say, everybody go out now? What's going to happen Sunday mornings? Nobody shows up, right? Because now I don't have to be together. So that commandment, when we think of the context of the Jewish people, that commandment was important because he said, y'all could be off doing your own thing now. You don't have to be at the temple because you don't have to come offer sacrifices together. There's no collective congregation that has to happen. So if we take one commandment alone, we say we go out, where I'm going out, God, I'm going on my own. And so I don't need to come to the assembly. But he's reminding them what's important if we're going to endure as a church, if we're going to endure in our faith. What do we need? Each other, right? And that's what he's coming back to. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves is talking about them not being off on their own, doing their own thing, but coming together, making sure they're coming together and encouraging each other and lifting each other up. So this idea, this simple phrase, these 4 words, let brotherly love continue. So we talked about the church. He's talking about the idea that love continues. Let's look at a couple verses real quick. Let love be without dissimulation, abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good, be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love, and honor, preferring one another, not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing instant in prayer, distributing to the necessity of saints, given to hospitality. Listen to the, don't just listen to the brotherly love piece, but look at the stuff that comes behind that, because that's all one sentence. So keep that in mind when we back to English class. That's all one sentence. So that's all tied together to being kindly affectionate one to another. What are we supposed to be? Preferring one and honoring and preferring one another, not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation. This is how we interact with each other. This isn't an individual guidance. This is how we work together. Continuing instant in prayer. And look at that last verse, because that's going to come up again in just a minute. Distributing to the necessity of saints, given to hospitality. So keep that in mind. This is part of how we love with one another. We care for each other. We don't slack off. That's what he talks about there. Not slothful in business, fervent in spirit. That we don't slack off when it comes to loving one another. We don't, when we rejoice together, when there's hope, when there's positive things happening. We sorrow in tribulation together. And we'll look at that in a minute as well. But the idea that we're commanded to let brotherly love continue. This verse is another one that one of my favorites because it's just simple and it's easy to remember. We'll get down in verse 17, but just context for it. Peter's talking here. He says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be the king as supreme, or unto governors, or unto them that are sent for punishment of evildoers, for the praise of him that do well. For this is the will of God, that we with well-doing may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So what's the context? Where were they facing then that Peter's talking to? Who was the king? Who was the king in Peter's time? Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man, whether it be the king or the supreme, as supreme. Who was the king at the time of Peter? Who was in charge at Peter's time? The Romans were. Caesar was, right? And what's Peter saying? Obey Caesar. Was that an easy thing for them to do? Was Caesar in line with their values and their principles as Christians? Do you think the conservative Christian voting bloc would support the Caesar? Not at all. But what's he say? Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. Now we know there's a limit to that, right? They still had to serve God. And that's what he talks about in there. He says, for so is the will of God, that you may in well-doing put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. You need to do what God says, but you also need to do what, you shouldn't use your freedom that you have under Christ now to do whatever you want. Yeah, there's some liberties there. But at the end, he says, here's the guidance. And he sums it up in this. And these 4 things. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Think of that. He says, love the brotherhood. What's that talking about again? The church, right? Love those around, love the church. He says, honor all men. Does that mean those in the church? Yes. Does that mean those outside the church? Absolutely. It says all men, right? I should respect all men, not just those in the church, but those outside the church as well. Well, that comes up in the next verse as well. Fear God. Because we can honor all men and we can love the brother, but if we don't fear God, what are we missing? The point, right? The point is that we're serving God and we're serving him in fear. And then honor the king. Again, it doesn't say serve the king. It doesn't say fear the king. What's it say? Honor the king, right? So we think of this idea of let brotherly love continue. It makes me think, and I've got the questions here because I want you to be thinking about these even when you leave here today. And I'm going to take a little bit of time because I want us to have a little bit of discussion on some of these. Because it's an easy punch that he's given us here, but there's a lot of weight behind it. So think about it. What does a commitment to brotherhood look like? What's it look like for us as believers? Describe it to me. Commitment to brotherhood or sisterhood as believers. Passion, caring, yeah. What else? It's intentional, right? It's not just kind of passive, like, oh, I hadn't seen you around. It's intentional. I didn't see you, now I'm going to take the extra step. What else? Praying. And we'll get to that in the later part of this chapter. He talks about praying a lot. What else? Sorry? Suffering. Yeah, absolutely. What does brotherhood look like? What does it, yeah. Yeah, they're sharpening each other, right? It's encouraging each other, exhorting each other, guiding each other. What does it require of us to be a part of the brotherhood? Effort, right? Sacrifice. Sorry? Selflessness and time, yep. It reminds me to put myself aside. Remember I put up there Matthew? Why do I put up there Matthew? What's he say? Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Remember we talked about that a few months back last summer about the loving your neighbor. It requires me not to love them the way I want to love them, but the way they want to be loved, and they need to be loved, right? It may not be the same. It may not be the same phone call. Maybe a text. Maybe the best way to reach them, right? Just that's not what I'm comfortable with. Well, maybe I need to sacrifice and learn so that I can reach that person and encourage that person the way they need to be encouraged or best encouraged. What else? What's it take for me to love others in brotherly love? You have to love God. Yeah. You got to love God first, right? I can try to love others the best I can of my own effort, right? But what's going to happen at the end of the day? Am I going to be satisfied or disappointed? I'm going to burn myself out. I'm going to get disappointed. People are going to, do wrong to me. And is that going to help me? I'm going to go love somebody else. I tried to love Brother Bryson, and he just rejected. He just shut the door on me. Every time I call him, he never answers my calls. I'm trying to encourage him. So what's going to happen if I'm doing it out of my own effort? He doesn't appreciate me. Yeah. I'm not going to want to love Brother Dunford then because, it didn't work for Brother Bryson. Why would I want to love Brother Dunford? Yeah, that's if I'm doing it out of my own motives, my own goals, what's going to happen? I'm going to fail. And so I've got to love God. I've got to have the love that God has for Brother Bryson, that I've got to continue to love him. Even if he shuts the door on me, I've got to continue to love him. So it takes loving God first. Keep that in mind, that simple 4 little words, let brotherly love continue. It's not easy, but it's interesting. He starts with that. If we're going to endure the challenges of the culture around us, if we're going to endure the persecutions, the ridicule, whatever it is, we're going to endure the culture, the fallen world that we have around us, what's it going to take first? Love for the Lord and love for the people of the Lord, right? That's what he starts with that. He says, if we're going to live a better life, if we're going to live for the better Christ, with the better covenant, with the better priest, so forth, we have to love each other. That's critical. All right, let's go on. Here's another one, and some people may have this in their house. I've seen it before. Some people have a sign on their wall that says, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." And this is an interesting one. I was talking to Rachel about it, or just kind of thinking it through, and I said, this idea of angels, I don't know. And I'm not going to try to pretend and give you some deep theological understanding what he means by angels here. But I do know what angels do. What do angels do? What was their role with God? They're messengers, right? And so some will say, well, we have angels walking among us, and they may show up at your door, and you need to be willing to welcome them in because they may be an angel and God may have sent them. But I don't know that, and that's like I said, I'm not going to put doubt to say yes or no either way. But I do know what's an angel do. It's a messenger, right? Who do they provide messages from? From God. So he says, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers." Okay, so the first verse we saw, let brotherly love continue. In the second verse, who's he talking about? Our brothers or not? Maybe, right? Maybe. But maybe strangers that we don't know. Look at Leviticus chapter 19. He's referring them back to a commandment he gave them in Leviticus. If a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, ye shall not vex him, but the stranger shall dwell with you, that dwell with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and you shall love them as yourself. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So the first reminder that he gives them, he's connecting them back to Leviticus. and the strangers that the sojourners that pass through. What are we as believers on this earth? We're sojourners, right? This isn't, our homes are not our homes, right? They're just a place for us to stay while we're here. And so how do we treat others that come along our way? Do we get defensive of we talked about this in, and I think I hit it in Isaiah 58. Actually, we'll go there in a minute. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality one to another without grumbling. The idea of hospitality, of welcoming others in that we may not know. Look at Isaiah 58. It is not to deal thy bread to the hungry. He's talking about the fasting that God is looking for that's acceptable. Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? The same idea here. Bring those that are without, that need, to bring them into your house, to welcome them in, to show love to others that are not those you're normally comfortable showing love to. Now, back in the day, what happened to believers? What was the situation they were facing again? Persecution, right? And what was happening to believers when they traveled? Where do you think they got to stay if they're facing persecution? If you're a wanted person, where do you get to stay when you travel? Where do you get to stay? What's available? What places are there to stay? At another believer's place. You didn't have the inns. You didn't want to let the Romans know you were a Christian, and you were word got out that you were traveling. It was dangerous for them, right? I mean, think of who Paul was. What was Paul's job? To seek out Christians and persecute them, right? So this was a situation that they were facing as the Hebrews, as believers, not just unbelievers, but as believers. They didn't have places to go. And so when a Christian came along that they didn't know, do you think it was really, how would you approach that? I mean, I've seen plenty of spy movies and the thrillers that you don't trust each other and all that. There was some distrust that was there. I don't know you. You just showed up at our church and you need a place to stay. What's he reminding them here? Bring them into your house. He says, show them hospitality. Show them the love that you would have for your brother. He says, and why is that? Let's continue. We'll get to the why in a minute. He says, for a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon to anger, but not given to wine, no striker, not given to filthy lucre, but a lover of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, temperate. This is a requirement for a pastor. Be what? Given to hospitality. As believers, how do we treat the stuff we have? How do we treat the stuff we have? As our own? Or as vehicles to use for God? I mean, think about this. That's what he's reminding. He says, be not forgetful of the strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. So how do we show hospitality to others? How do we show hospitality to others?
You can do it in a lot of ways. You can invite them to coffee or tea or dinner, or just to come over to visit.
Yeah, it's could be simple. Yeah, it could be as simple as just, hey, come sit with me for a bit. I drink coffee in the morning. Come on over. Let's have a chat. What else? How do we show hospitality? Take a meal to someone. Take some food to them. Care for them. Now, green bean casserole, I won't bring that up again. But you make sure they like green bean casserole before you take it over. What else? Hospitality to others. How do we show that?
You can send notes or calls.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily be my house, right?
Or somebody else.
Yeah. It's my time, my energy, my resources, and extending those towards someone else. It's easier to do that for those in the church, right? Sometimes, but hopefully it is. If it's not, then we need another lesson, I think, really more in depth about the first one, about letting brotherly love continue. But those outside the church, sometimes it's easy to, our neighbors. How do we know our neighbor? How well do we know our neighbors? Do we know the 8 people around us? That's usually the measure we say of how well we know our neighbors. The 5 in front and the 3, or 4, 6 in front and the 2 on the side. How well do you know your neighbors? That's how you show hospitality, right? Welcoming and inviting them into the neighborhood. When you got new folks that move in next to you, I always say you can choose your family a lot better. You can choose your neighbors, because you can pick who you marry, but you can't pick who moves next to you. There's a hospitality level, or level of hospitality you have to have as a neighbor in your community where you're at, right? You're Jerusalem. So why are strangers important? He says here, and this is an interesting phrase, but he says, entertain strangers. Why do you think strangers are important to us and growing in love?
Well, we normally gravitate towards people we know, and care about the people we know, instead of the actual stranger, somebody that you may just first meet. If you don't show them hospitality and kindness, why would they ever want to find out about your faith?
Yeah, it's easy for us to...
Christ's love should shine through you.
Exactly. It's easy for us to love those that we know, right? Those that have the similar interests that we're comfortable with, that we've seen each other forever. I know people have shared before, move to a different seat in the church. Let's start with that. That's a good way to find strangers, because there's people on the other side of the auditorium you may not have talked to in a long time. But the idea that we get so comfortable and we get to who we know and to who comes over and who our circles that we work in. But he says, be not forgetful to entertain strangers. And there's a reason he says forgetful, because what happens? We get in a routine, we get in a rut, and we don't think about those that aren't like us, right? The stranger doesn't look like us, probably. They may dress a little different. They may talk a little different. Or I may not even know how they talk, because I saw them over there and I don't know who they are, so I'm not going to take the time to get to know them. But he says there, be not forgetful to entertain strangers. What do strangers help us understand? Okay, so we can understand about the stranger, but what else can we understand? What do we learn from a stranger? Ourselves. You ever think about that? When we get to know a stranger, we get to understand our weaknesses, our challenges. You ever been challenged by somebody who you didn't know? It's easy to go around folks you know all the time. They don't ask you tough questions because they're your friends, and they want to maintain that relationship. You ever been in a taxi cab with somebody before, on an airplane with someone, and you sit next to someone and they're a complete stranger, and within 30 minutes of that flight or whatever, you've learned their whole life story. You've got a whole different perspective on the challenges that you face, the things that you're hoping and dreaming of, because you just met this stranger that's got a whole different perspective. So when he says there, be not forgetful for strangers, there's an important aspect there, that the stranger is important to us. If we in our Christian lives are only knowing those that we're familiar with, we're not doing the work of Christ. And let's not forget this last part. Thereby some have entertained angels unawares. What did angels do? Messengers of God, right? So if I'm entertaining a stranger, maybe God's got a lesson for me by entertaining that stranger. Maybe God's going to teach me something that I didn't get out of the service today, because I got around all the same people I knew and I went to the same service, the same time, same routine. But I met a stranger this afternoon and God enlightened me that said, wait, remember that verse you learned in church today? Now you get a chance to apply it. The idea that those angels are messengers, those strangers are messengers for us. They help us learn something that we didn't realize. So when we think about this idea of what are some of the messages that we may be missing? How we can grow in God. The person that looks different may not be so different than me. That the person that looks different is facing the same challenges or has the same hopes and dreams as I do. But until I start to entertain strangers, what's going to happen? What happens to the church that doesn't entertain the church? I'm not talking about the body, but the individuals of the church that don't entertain strangers. You don't grow. You're not fulfilling the commandment that God says to go, right? Imagine if you grew up your life as James and John around the Sea of Galilee, and he says, go. And now you've got to go to Asia. You've got to go to Northern Europe. I know they didn't go Australia, wherever. Imagine that now you've lived there your whole life, and he says, now go. Who are they going to meet? Everybody's a stranger, right? Everybody is. So if we're going to fulfill the commandment to go, we've got to be not forgetful of the strangers, of entertaining those strangers. And again, that's believers and unbelievers. But the idea that if we get stuck with the folks that we always see, we're going to miss something. We're going to miss the messages that God may have for us. All right, let's look at the next one. Remember them that are in the bonds, are in bonds, as bound with them, and them which suffer adversity, as being yourselves also in the body. So he talks about brotherly love. He talks about strangers. And now he talks about remembering those in bonds and them that suffer adversity. So we know that we know that throughout this, he talks about, throughout the Bible, we see that the prisoner is one that God has compassion on. It's interesting. Why would God have compassion on the prisoner? He's talking specifically, I think, here towards the Christians that are in bonds. Because what were they facing? Persecution, right? He says, don't forget those that have been captured, and put into bonds. Like, they got caught. We were just going to hunker down and hide so we don't get caught too. But what's he say? Don't forget them. So, because it wasn't a good situation when you were in bonds. And I know you did a study of Acts recently, and you know what that's like, and the things that they face and what Paul needed to be supported. But he says those that are in bonds. But when he thinks, look at what it says here. For ye had compassion of me in my bonds, in chapter 10, verse 34, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods, and knowing in yourselves that ye have in heaven a better and enduring substance. Just a few chapters ago, the author talks about that. He says, you had compassion on me in your bonds, and you gave of yourselves, knowing that you didn't have to give, but you knew that heaven had a better substance for you. And it's better that you take care of me so that the gospel can continue. Like, that's what he's talking about there. So we see that there's the believer. And we see in Psalm 69, he says, I will praise the name of God with a song and will magnify him with thanksgiving. This also shall please the Lord better than an ox or a bullock's that hath horns and hooves. The humble shall see this and be glad, and your heart shall live that seek God. For the Lord heareth the poor and despiseth not his prisoners. This verse reminds me of Paul and Barnabas in the prison at Philippi. And what did they do when they're in the prison at Philippi? They sang unto the Lord, right? They sang praise unto the Lord, and the prisoners heard them. And it's the idea that the Lord heareth the poor and despises not the prisoner. So often we think of the prisoner and we look down upon him, right? And these are Christian prisoners. But we also see in Matthew 25, he says, for I was hungered and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger and ye took me in. Naked and ye clothed me. I was sick and ye visited me. I was in prison and you came unto me. And we just further down, he says, the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. The idea, it's easy for us to forget those we lock away. Whether it's believers that are locked away and we just say, I'm in fear going to stay away from them, or whether it's those that have been convicted and locked away. That's an easy population of people to just kind of forget. They're hard to access, right? For one thing, you can't just go and show up at a prison and say, hey, I'm here to visit whoever wants to see me. It's hard to access them. But in the same sense, they're what? How are they viewed in society? The lowest of the low. And Christ says, if you're going to show love, who do you need to show love to? The lowest of the low. He says, if you're going to show love, I want you to show love to those that people have forgotten about. That people have said it'd be better if they just wasted away. So we said the brother, then we had the stranger, which is the Christian and the other visitors that come to our door. And then it's the folks that we don't even see, that's easy to forget about. The people that are suffering, either rightly or wrongly, they're suffering, right? And he says, you need to show love unto them. He says, and this verse comes to mind because it's what in the second part, actually, he says there, and them that which suffer adversity is being yourselves also in the body. Right? So he's not just talking about those that are locked up, but he says what? Suffer adversity as being yourselves also in the body. And this verse comes to mind, Galatians 6, 1-3. He says, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so what? Fulfill the law of Christ. It's interesting, again, we see what? Remember, after studying Hebrews, every time you see the law, it should change your perspective of what he's talking about there. He says, so fulfill the law of Christ. For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Why does God have compassion on the prisoner and want us to have compassion on the prisoner? Or the downtrodden, those that are in adversity, those that have been overtaken in a fault. Why does he want us to have compassion? Nobody else will. And how are we? Who are we? We are guilty. He had compassion on us. We are no more worthy than the prisoner that's sitting in prison for life, right? Sin is sin. We're as guilty as he is. So the reason why he says there, remember them that are in bonds as bound with them, and also which suffer adversity as being yourselves also in the body. He's pointing out, reminding, he says, you're no better. You were a sinner, saved by what? Grace. Remember, this whole thing is about grace and the idea of the work of God's grace. So what bonds and adversity do people end up in? We know prisons. That's easy. I was just talking about the guy that was on this car chase that ran into the van and the lady we know that passed away. He's in prison. He got locked up Saturday night. Was on the run, is in prison. I'm glad he's in prison. He was a felon. They had weapons on him. He's not safe to be out in the public. That makes sense why he's in bonds. What are some other bonds and adversities we find ourselves in as believers? Okay, so there's physical adversities. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's challenges that we face, right? Disappointments. We lose our jobs. We end up with troubles that come our way. What else? Look on the left side. It's been quiet over there. I'm going to start calling out sections now. What else? What other bonds and adversities do we have? Do people end up in? Sometimes they come from outside, right? So we have disasters that happen, things that happen in our lives that we don't have control over. And there's some things that we do ourselves, right? Let's go back to Galatians. If a man be overtaken in a fault, do you think the guy just happened to fall into something? What's it say? Overtaken in a fault. He was wrong, right? Something he didn't do something right? And what's he say? We need to restore him. We need to bring him back into fellowship. We need to help him step back up in his faith. There's things that we do that we fall, right? As believers, spiritually, physically. We make decisions each day that put us into bonds and adversities. There's addictions that people fall into, right? Those are bonds. Addictions are bonds. They're physical bonds. As much as people want to think themselves out of an addiction, it's an addiction. There's a physical aspect to it. But there's also a spiritual aspect to it, right? And a lot of times those addictions come from spiritual challenges and not addressing those. So we need to what? We need to consider them, right? Remember them. We need to work with them and care for them. How do we remember and suffer with them that are struggling in bonds and adversities? We pray for them, okay? Have compassion for them. What else? You spend time, you counsel, you help them, right? I was talking to someone, we talked about this a while ago about loving your neighbor. And someone came and talked to me afterwards about we need to be careful how we approach people, right? If I'm going to suffer, if I see someone suffering, should I just come, okay, get yourself up, let's go? What's he talk about in Galatians, or in there? He says what? Consider thyself, lest thou also be tempted. He says, bear one another's burdens. Does that mean I just let people walk all over me and just do whatever you want? Just take all my money kind of thing? No, he says bear one another. Work. It's going to take time. You're going to have to set boundaries. You're going to have to work with them and care for them and work with them. And that's in the church, right? And outside of the church. That's for those unbelievers. I was talking to Brother Corey actually about the bus ministry and the work they do with the families that are on the bus ministry. Yeah. Mm. And you're doing God's will. Mm-hmm. God can do better work than we can. He just wants us to be that vessel and take our time with it, not rush it. Yeah, we've got to be careful, and we can spend a lot of time on this lesson, but there's a difference between creating enabling behaviors where we're just giving and supporting and doing it in a way that actually empowers them to be able and let God be able to work through us, not just here you go, here's a blank check, go solve your housing problem kind of thing. But if I can work with them and say, let me help you find a job, let me help you fill out the application. Doesn't mean I'm doing it for them, but it means I'm going to help them. I'm going to come alongside them, right?
You just have to be committed. You have to make that commitment, and you have to. In my life, I have to make that commitment. I have to ask God to give me everything I need to see that commitment through, to finish it, to always be there for that person. And that's it sometimes for myself, because I don't have a lot of free time, just like everybody else I know.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
We didn't go into the verses here, but what about the Samaritan? When he asks, who's your neighbor? What's the example Christ gives? The Samaritan, who went out of his way and to help him. Did he, and we'll obviously have to come back next week to finish this up, but did he spend time with the Samaritan and say, okay, I'm going to sit with you until you're better? No. What did he do? He made provisions. He got him to where he needed, and he said, I'll come back and check on him. But he had a life to take care of too, right? He couldn't sacrifice everything for this one person, but he sacrificed to care for this person, to make sure that he could care for this person. So we as believers, we have to. It's going to take time. It's going to take commitment. It's going to take us out of our routines, out of our comfort zones. It's going to take us out of our houses. We may not be able to spend the time doing the things we want to do, but what are we called to do? To care, to love, right? We're called to remember them in their bonds. And them which suffer adversity as being also in the body. The idea when they suffer adversity, I've got to see it as if I'm them. Put myself in their shoes, and remember that we're in this together. So last one, we'll finish out on commitment because I can do this one quickly, I believe. So this last one sounds odd because, so we talked about brotherly love. He talks about those that are strangers. Then he talks about those that are suffering and in bonds. And then lastly, in verse 4, he says, marriage is honorable in all, the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. And it sounds like an odd kind of placement in here when he's talking about love and then he's talking about judgment of adulterers and whoremongers. But what he's talking about here is, we see it's reflected in Ephesians chapter 5 when Christ is the head of the church and gave himself for it. And he talks about, and we'll look at this word here, honorable. That word honorable is the same word that's used as precious in 1 Peter chapter 1. He says, but with precious blood of Christ as of the Lamb without blemish and without spot. For as much as you're redeemed not with corruptible things, but with the precious blood of Christ. That's the same thing that he's talking about when he says precious. I did a study, I think it was last summer or summer before last, with our young adult class around Song of Solomon and marriage, and looking at this idea that why is marriage important to God? What kind of covenant is the marriage covenant? We talked about covenants several weeks ago. What kind of covenant is the marriage covenant? Is it a transactional covenant or is it a one-way covenant?
Transaction.
Okay. Why? You don't have to. Okay. It's two people, but it's a one-way covenant, right? It's a transactional covenant, but there's no conditions attached. Let me put it that way. It's a transaction between two people, but there's no conditions, right? We talked about there's some covenants that are conditional, where they say, if you do this, then you will, then I'll be with you. Remember we saw that was the Mosaic covenant. If you follow me, I will be your God. But what did he say? But what was the Abrahamic covenant? I will make you a people. The marriage covenant is a unconditional covenant. It's a covenant that says, I'm committing to you, regardless. And that's an example of what? The new covenant that Christ has made with us. He says, I will be I'm your God. Yeah, I will say I've shed my blood for you. And this is the same idea, that precious blood. It's unconditional, right? God's salvation isn't conditional upon anything we can do, right? So to him, it's the same. It's an image of what salvation is. Whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in this world through lust. It's interesting there. He says that same word, precious promises, is the same as the precious blood. Is the same as the honorable marriage. So when we think about this, so there's some examples here that the marriage relationship gives us. Does our love for our spouse reflect our love for Christ? If someone were to look at our marriage and say, yeah, I can see Christ in that. How y'all love each other is how Christ loves us, right? That's what should be reflected in our marriage. But let me ask this. Are we encouraging, for those that say, they've been married much longer than I've been alive, are we encouraging those in my generation to have that same kind of marriage, that same kind of love? Are you encouraging younger families to, by your example, through your hospitality, through your opportunity to get to know them and to build those relationships? Are you encouraging them to have that same love? And then this one is, lastly, I'll share this, is I think there's an aspect when he talks about the marriage bed is honorable in all. The idea that we understand with the marriage bed, it's a very polite way of talking about marriage and a very special aspect of marriage. But do we have the same passion for knowing Christ and and spending time with Christ and being and seeing Christ eye to eye like we do our spouse? Like, that's what he's talking about here. That commitment to Christ, like we have the commitment to our spouse. Think about that. Do we want to see Christ and spend time with Christ and get to know Christ and just enjoy the time we have with Christ the same way we do with our earthly spouse? Like, that's what he's talking about here. And it says, and then we think, how do we guard our marriages? Because that's the last part of that verse. It says, how do we guard our marriages in faith, in faith in the face of a fallen world? There's a lot of, if Satan's going to attack the church and wants to stop Christ, where is he going to attack us? Our brotherly love. He's going to make us want to come together and not want to go out, right? And see strangers, because it's dangerous to see strangers. He's going to put us in fear. He's going to want us not to go and see the lowest because we've been redeemed, and he wants us to have a high mind. He wants pride to seep in. And then lastly, where does he want to attack? The family, the home. It's interesting. Those 4 things are 4 commitments that we should have. Commitment to our brothers, commitment to strangers, commitment to the lowest, and commitment to our families. And so we'll look at the rest of the book and we talk about what it means to love. You can read ahead, and if you want to look at some of the verses and study ahead, that feel free to. But again, these are quick punches that a lot of times we pull those verses out and we quote them. We don't really think about what it means in the context that he's talking about. This was critical for the church's health, that they show love one to another, that they loved the stranger, they loved the prisoner, and that they loved that they had strong families. And so when we think about this for Hebrews, this is what I want you to end on as we get down further on. Any questions? I know we're over 2 minutes. Yes, sir.
First one tonight is about a couple of brothers and one sister. It surprised me.
Yeah. Yeah. But when we suffer adversity, it's good to know others suffer adversity with us and same challenges. Yeah. Yeah, and it's knowing one another as a body of believers. Because what happens if we, and I'll just end on this, if we as a body of believers suffer alone, what's going to happen to our faith? What does that do to our faith? If I don't share anything, or others don't share anything with me of the challenges they face, what happens when I face challenges? It lowers your faith. Those challenges become even bigger to me. But if I know I've got a body of believers supporting me, encouraging me, God showing me how to overcome those challenges, what's going to happen to those challenges? They're not going to be as big anymore. They're not going to be as insurmountable. I'm going to know what the path to take to get over those mountains, to survive them a little better, because I've got the guide of those brothers and sisters around me. All right, well, thank you. Let's close on a word of prayer. I know we're over. I apologize for that, but hopefully this is worthwhile.